Hello and welcome to the session Revolutionize SAP BTP Extensions with the AWS SDK for ABAP to implement a clean core strategy. My name's Adam Hill. I'm a SAP Principal Specialist Solution Architect at AWS, and I sit within our worldwide go-to-market team and lead what we call our SAP Technical Field Community within AWS. I'm joined by John Friesen, who is a senior sysdev within our SAP engineering team at AWS. And John will be taking over later on in the session to do some demos and talk more about the SDK. Okay, so let's jump in. So firstly, in this session, we're going to cover 4 key topics, and then we'll take questions as we're talking along. So if you have questions, put them in the chat, but we'll also open up at the end for any questions you have. I'm going to kick off by introducing what we call the AWS SDK for SAP ABAP. We commonly shorten this to the ABAP SDK because it's a bit of a mouthful. I'm then going to move on and share some examples of how customers are already innovating their use of the ABAP SDK and the benefits they've seen. I'm then going to hand over to John, who's going to go deeper into the developer experience with the ABAP SDK and go through a series of demos. And then we'll wrap up with how you can get started with the ABAP SDK and answer any questions that we've not covered during this session. So let's jump in. So having worked with millions of AWS customers, thousands of SAP customers, and reflecting on Amazon's own journey, we believe there are a number of things that separate enterprises who sustain their success from those that don't. In our experience, companies who stand the test of time are typically ready and able to adapt as needed. And we call this at Amazon the innovation imperative. As companies adapt, we see many innovating and transforming their businesses in a multitude of ways. Some examples of that are what are many customers doing today. They're looking to delight their customers more, increase satisfaction with personalization and tailored support, maximize productivity through accelerating business processes by the use of Gen AI and process automation, improve decision-making with better business insights and real-time monitoring and advanced analytics. And finally, optimize production through improved throughput, reduce defects, downtime and waste. And many of those customers are running SAP, and what we see our SAP customers are looking to do is extend their SAP systems with cloud services while keeping their core clean. And this is where we believe what we call the AWS SDK for SAP ABAP, commonly known as the ABAP SDK, can play a key part. So what is the actual ABAP SDK? Well, the ABAP SDK makes it easier for ABAP developers to extend and transform SAP-based business processes by harnessing the power of the AWS services seamlessly while using the native SAP ABAP language. So the ABAP SDK fills a long-standing gap that we've seen between the ABAP Builder community and the AWS Services and Cloud Builder community. And we developed the SDK having heard from many customers that they wanted an SAP native way to consume the 200 plus AWS services that we offer. So with the ABAP SDK, you can accelerate business process innovation by giving your ABAP developers access to those 200 plus services, including latest services such as generative AI services like Amazon Bedrock. You can reduce the architectural complexity by eliminating the need to manually create complex integrations between SAP and AWS services. And this applies in both what we call self-managed, where the customers manage in those SAP environments, and RISE with SAP deployments. Security is job zero at AWS, and you can maintain a strong security posture with the SDK by encrypting all payloads with HTTPS and enforcing SAP level permissions in terms of what users can do and not do with the SDK. And then finally, you can upskill your ABAP development teams by making it easy for them to go and build cloud-based solutions. So for what we call the on-stack edition of the SDK, it's delivered as a set of SAP transports that you import into each SAP system that you want to use the SDK in. There's a core transport that needs to be installed first. And then for each AWS service that you want to use, there's an individual transport to import. So you only need to import the transports of the AWS services you want to use. And it's a very straightforward, simple installation routine that all basis teams will be comfortable doing. So having launched what we call now the on-stack edition of the ABAP SDK in Q4 2022, we heard from customers that they would love to be able to use the ABAP SDK to build side-by-side extensions using SAP BTP ABAP Cloud. So I'm pleased to say in June 2024, we launched the ABAP SDK for SAP ABAP BTP edition into preview. As the name implies, this SDK is now available within the SAP BTP ABAP environment, making it even easier for developers to incorporate those AWS services into SAP ABAP applications inside BTP. enabling you to build those side-by-side extensions and standalone applications while keeping your SAP Core Clean. Customers who join the developer preview can deploy the SDK BTP edition in their BTP ABAP environment, and John will demo this later on. It's provided as a partner product that you install using the SAP Landscape portal, and John's going to go into a more detailed demo later on how that is done. The key thing is that solutions developed for the SDK, be it on-stack or BTP, are mutually compatible, which means that if you develop code on the on-stack version, you can move that code up to the BTP version and vice versa, which gives customers lots of choice and options of where they run the code. So we'd encourage you all to look at that BTP edition, sign up for the preview using the QR code on the screen, and I'll also show that link at the end as well. So let's take a look at the actual architecture and how it fits into your SAP landscape. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you have the on-stack deployment. So this is going to be ECC or S/4HANA. At the lowest level, we've got the operating system as a basis, guys, we all know and love. On top of that, you've got the database. Now, this could be a HANA or any DB. And then on top of that, you've got the SAP kernel. And then finally, you've got the SAP ABAP programming language. And within this stack, obviously, you've got your different SAP standard modules, MM, SD, etc., that are running your enterprise. Now, many of those modules can be extended through the use of extensions. These can trigger actions, exchange information, transform data, etc. And this is where the AWS SDK for SAP ABAP comes into the picture. Interacting with those extensions, the SDK enables you as an ABAP developer to use any of the 200 plus AWS services via the REST APIs, as you can see on the diagram. The on-stack version supports NetWeaver ABAP version 7.4 and above, both through self-managed deployments, on-premise, on any cloud, and RISE on AWS or RISE on any other hyperscaler deployments as well. So you have complete flexibility where you use the SDK. Wherever you can run SAP, you can run the SDK. And then for the BTP edition on the right-hand side, it's deployed within that BTP ABAP Cloud environment. And from there, you can consume all the same 200 plus services as part of building side-by-side extensions. In both scenarios, all calls to AWS services are made by REST APIs over secure HTTPS-based connections. So your data is always secure in transit. Now, one question we often get asked from customers is, how does the ABAP SDK fit into a clean core strategy? Well, firstly, when we release updates to the ABAP SDK, we avoid what we call breaking changes, which means that you can import the latest transport or partner product update for BTP for a service without worrying that this is going to break the existing ABAP code you've written in the extension to use that AWS service. Also, the ABAP SDK is independent of application functionality. It only uses those underlying basis functions, which have been stable for 3 decades. So the SDK won't break after an SAP upgrade either. And secondly, by adopting the ABAP SDK to extend your standard SAP functionality, you're cutting down on the amount of ABAP codes you need to develop and using the AWS services as a set of APIs to do what we call the heavy lifting for you. So this is just reducing the amount of custom code you need to write. And finally, in the future, if you find an extension you've created within SAP has now been replaced by new functionality, and you no longer need to call that AWS service because SAP have provided that functionality in a later update, you can just simply remove the extension and return to standard and continue then using new functionality from SAP without having to worry about that legacy code being in your system anymore. So that's an overview of the architecture of the SDK. Let's move on and look at how some customers are already using the SDK. So some of the areas we're seeing customers innovate using the 200 plus services we provide are things like finance. So for example, we have customers that have used TextTrack, which is our machine learning powered OCR service, to process invoices and take the data out of those invoices and post them in SAP. We've also seen customers using Bedrock, which is our generative AI service, to actually summarize RFX and RFQ responses and then get a distilled response using generative AI. On the sales side, again, we're seeing customers automate sales orders processing using TextTrack for OCR. In marketing, we've seen customers use the ability to personalize content using Amazon Personalize and Bedrock to generate customer-specific personalized content when they send that out via SAP. On supply chain, we've seen customers looking to automate the ability of tracking of assets using our blockchain service and IoT services. And then finally, for analytics, we've seen customers looking to automate the bi-directional data flows from SAP using services like Amazon AppFlow and Glue, and then visualize that data using our Amazon QuickSight product and use the generative BI capabilities of that product powered by Amazon Q now. So a number of different areas that we're seeing customers use the services. If we jump into some examples, Now, many of these examples I'm going to show you have come from hackathons. Last year, we ran a number of hackathons with customers, and customers were able to actually build working prototypes within a few hours. So one of those customers was a global insurance company who wanted to reduce the manual effort of accounts receivable and accounts payable processes within their organization. They had a large volume of AR and AP data spread across multiple different sources, different formats and quality levels, coming across as interfaces into their SAP system. So they were able to take that data, process that using a machine learning service from AWS, cleanse the data, look for anomalies in the data, and then automate the processing and matching of that data into GL using the SDK. Key benefits they saw from this was it significantly reduced manual effort by up to 90%. They're able to increase the quality of data processed through the automation, and they're able to improve the reporting and forecasting they can provide to their C-suite to enable better decision-making in faster time. Another example is a fashion house who used the SDK to improve the quality of their customer master data. So previously, when orders were taken, addresses were being typed in manually, there was errors in the addresses, incorrect addresses, and this was impacting customer satisfaction and delivery. They're able to very quickly, using the SDK, integrate our location service for address validation and enrichment. And what that meant was then they had the address data, which was much higher quality when it was entered into the order system. And then when those orders were sent out, they would be delivered on time. So the benefits they saw was a reduced delivery time, improved customer satisfaction, and reduced manual effort from salespeople having to go back in and fix that sales data and the address data. Another customer who's seen real value is an online auto seller who accelerated their accounts receivable process. So this leading vehicle marketplace was receiving lots and lots of checks every month that they needed to process and visually match against invoices and customer records. And that was taking significant amounts of time and expense. So they implemented the SDK as an enhancement to their process, and they were able to extract the data from the checks using TextRack, the OCR service I mentioned earlier on. Take that data, compare it with invoices using ABAP code, and do the two-way matching. And that enabled them to significantly speed up the processing of those thousands of checks they receive each month. The key benefits they saw was reduced labor costs from automating the processing of those thousands of checks, improved cash flow because they're able to process the checks quicker into the bank and get the cash into their business. And then finally, increased customer satisfaction because customers could see they processed the checks and paid off the invoices. And then finally, to wrap up, one of our customers is a global media giant who needed to send out SAP documents in multiple different languages. Historically, they were translating these manually within SAP, uploading different formats of the document in different languages. That was very time consuming every time they made a change. So they're able to use the SDK and our translate service to actually translate those documents on the fly into the preferred language of the customer and then send those documents out via our email service. What this meant in terms of benefits was much more improved experience for customers because they received documents in a language that they understood. That reduced the number of calls back into the call center because the customers could understand the documents and didn't have to translate themselves. And it also reduced the manual effort to translate and send those documents. So that's just 4 examples of customers that have already used the SDK and implemented it in their business processes and seen the benefits that it can bring. And now I'm going to hand over to John, who's going to go into the developer experience and show some demos.
Thanks so much, Adam, and welcome again, everyone, to this presentation. I'm John Friesen. I'm a senior system developer here at AWS. I'm on the engineering team where we make the products and services that make your SAP systems feel like they were born to run in the cloud. Today, I'm going to talk about 2 of my favorite topics, which is AWS and SAP. And I'm especially excited to talk to an audience of developers because AWS is a company of builders and we make tools for builders. And you, the ABAP developers, are builders too. So you are our people. You know, we make tools for developers, and core to that is our suite of SDKs. You know, AWS makes web services, and the way that developers consume our services is through SDKs. We have SDKs for Python, Java, .NET, C++, Swift, Kotlin, Rust, Go, and that's why we were so proud to release an AWS SDK for the SAP ABAP programming language. I think ABAP is a beautiful language. It's going to live forever. And so it's only fitting that a full-fledged ABAP SDK should be available for AWS services. And I want to emphasize that our SDK for ABAP is not some stripped down half product. It is a full-fledged SDK that is feature compatible with all of our other SDKs for other languages. So if you hear some Python programmer or Java programmer bragging about the cool stuff that they can do with AWS, you can do exactly the same stuff with ABAP. And I mean that literally. We've got a service at AWS that lets systems talk to satellites in space. Would you like your SAP system to talk to space? You can do it with the ABAP SDK. So you, the ABAP programmers, you don't need to feel left out of the world of the cloud and all the excitement around AWS services. You've got a seat at the table and you're invited to the party. Now, here at AWS, we like to start from the customer experience when we're designing a new product. And in the case of an SDK, you, the ABAP developer, are the customer, and your experience, the developer experience, is the customer experience. So we're going to go through since we're all coders here, we're going to go through the anatomy of a simple program that consumes AWS services in ABAP. And to start with, any ABAP program that is consuming AWS services using our SDK is going to create a session object which links to configuration in the IMG in classic ABAP or in the business configuration of a BTP ABAP system using what we call an SDK profile. So if you've ever configured an ABAP system using profiles that kind of group configuration together, you already know exactly how this kind of thing works. And we pass an SDK profile ID, which links to the configuration, and that enables the SDK to check your PFCG role, or in BTP is called a business role. Check your business role to make sure your user is authorized to use that SDK profile. It authenticates the system to AWS, and then it maps you to what we call an IAM role on the AWS side, which is your fine-grained permissions on the AWS side. So your fine-grained permissions on the SAP side are mapped to fine-grained permissions on the AWS side that match your job function. So once it's done all that stuff, then you get the session object, and you can pass that to a factory class to create a client object for whichever of our 200 plus services you decide to consume. So maybe you want to talk to space, then you use our service for talking to satellites. Here I'm using our S3 service, which is our cloud storage. I want to maybe pull a document from S3 storage. So I'm creating an S3 client object, and then consuming the service is as simple as, for example, here I'm calling the get object method on the S3 client. And you can see it's a one-liner. I'm passing it the name of a bucket, which is where the objects live, and the key to an object. And I pull in that file into my ABAP system with a one-liner. And then I can, maybe it's an Excel format, I want to process it. And even handling error cases in the service call is as simple as catching an exception. So the point here is we wanted our SDK to feel natural and native in an ABAP system. This kind of code will feel instantly familiar to any ABAP programmer, and a junior programmer can do very amazing things with our SDK without too much effort. Now we have a bunch of examples out on the web, example code and tutorials and so forth, but there's many, many more such examples in other programming languages which have had SDKs for much longer. So as a little exercise yesterday, I thought, you know what, I'm going to write an ABAP program for a service that I've never consumed before. And so I decided to try using our recognition service, which is our image recognition and analysis service. And so I went and found a Python tutorial that had a little snippet of Python code, and I thought I'm going to translate that to ABAP. And I just want to illustrate here as we go through side by side the Python example and the ABAP example that it was a line for line translation. So very easy. The first part of any program is going to be creating that session object and then creating a client object, in this case for the recognition service in ABAP. So that's our image recognition service. And then consuming the service is just calling a method. That's true in Python or in Java or in JavaScript or in ABAP. So it's trivial to translate the Python code into ABAP code to pass a series of bytes containing an image to the service, and then receive the results, which is, in this case, I want to find out how many faces are in an image. And so here I'm getting a table of faces, and just want to print out the number of faces that were in the image. And error handling, as usual, is just catching an exception. So I can go and find any blog or tutorial for any programming language really consuming our services and very easily translate it into ABAP. And this is really important because, as we know, ABAP programs are not written, they're copied. And so it's nice to start from someone else's example. Now, when I said earlier that our SDK is held to the same standards as our other SDKs, I meant it. And I want to explain what I mean by that. Every day, AWS is producing some updates to some services. We have so many services, and we're innovating so quickly that every single day some service is getting updated, or maybe a new service is being introduced. And our goal is, when we post a blog or an announcement about some new service or new feature, customers should be able to download the SDK that day and try the new feature out. So we don't want the customers to read a blog and then not be able to try it out. So that means that we're producing a new ABAP SDK every single day. And just to prove it, let's just go pop over to our release notes here. And on the day of this recording, we can see what happened yesterday, that we introduced, for example, for our QuickSight service, we added a new API, this list folders for resource. That's kind of interesting. And if we look at the day before, we actually introduced a brand new service. This is a service for our AWS directory service. That's basically our managed Active Directory. And they added a whole new API to our managed Active Directory, which lets you query and the users and groups that are in Active Directory. I can actually go see the release this on the day of this recording earlier yesterday. They made this blog announcement about this new feature, and I can see that the very same day, our SDK, you could download it and try it out. And it's kind of cool, actually. If I can query Active Directory, it means that I could, for example, populate the users in my ABAP system based on Active Directory without having to use the LDAP connector. So anyways, really exciting to see that pace of innovation, and we hold our SDK to the same standard. We have more than 200 services. Some services have more than one API, which is why we have, I think, 391 as of today, 391 API modules in our ABAP SDK. Now let's move on to what it looks like to install the SDK in BTP ABAP. I'm going to pop over to my BTP ABAP system here. And first, I'm going to go to a tool called the Landscape Portals. This is not my BTP ABAP. This is my BTP Landscape Portal system. If you've never used Landscape Portal, it's pretty cool. It has features like a feature to stop and start your ABAP systems on a predefined schedule if you want to save some money by turning your dev systems off at night. But they also have a product here, or a service called Deploy Product. If I go click on Deploy Product, it lets me choose from a list of available products that I can install into my BTP ABAP system. Now, we are in developer preview, so you have to join our developer preview. But if you join our dev preview, then you'll find this SDK Omni partner product, which I can go and click on, and I can choose the version I want to install. And then I can choose which systems from my list of BTP ABAP systems I want to install it on. And we can actually see that I installed a couple of days ago. I installed it on my system JF6, and it took about an hour and 11 minutes. So you can schedule it to install overnight. And that's all there is to it. And then I've got the SDK installed. I can start using it. Once I've installed the SDK, if I go to my BTP ABAP systems, now I'm in my system JF6 here, and I can go to business process configuration and go to custom business configurations. So this is the IMG style config for a BTP ABAP system. And if you've ever used our classic SDK and its IMG, you'll find the same settings here in BTP ABAP. So in my SDK profile, where I can configure different SDK configuration profiles. Maybe I've got one for finance, one for HR. We can go and find various useful settings for controlling how does the SDK authenticate and what IAM role I am mapped to and so forth. So that's the configuration process. Now let's go take a look at a little bit of code. We saw a little bit of code earlier, but let's go have some fun. I'm going to go pop open my trusty Eclipse here. And here I'm in the code of my BTP ABAP system, and I've got a little hello world program here. And by the way, we have the code for this program out on our documentation page too. So if you ever go through our getting started guide, you'll find this code. And all it's doing is we've already seen how the anatomy works here. We create a session object. We create a client object for the service we want to consume. In this case, I'm going to use our translate service, which translates text in real time from one language to another. And finally, here I have my one-liner that's going to translate my text from language 1 to language 2. And my text here is hello BTP developers, and my language is from English to German. And then I'm just going to print it out in my my Eclipse here. And just for fun, because hello BTP developers isn't fun enough, I want to say my favorite month is Devtober, and ABAP in the cloud is the best ABAP. Let's try that as a phrase to translate, just to prove that this is not translating configuration data. This is transactional data. And we'll go ahead and run it and see if it works. Here we go. Now, I don't speak German, so I'm not going to try to pronounce this. But hopefully there's some German speakers on here who can tell us whether we did a good job of translating it. But look how easy that ABAP program was, and it translated instantaneously. And think of all the use cases that you could use if you have got a multilingual workforce and you want to make sure that whoever's processing a service order can process it in their native language, regardless of what the language of the original submitter was. There's a 1,000 use cases for this, and in BTP ABAP, you could simply enhance your OData services to use it. So I think that's really exciting, and I love the developer experience. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how to approach our AWS services. I'm assuming the audience here is an audience of ABAP developers who might not be so familiar with AWS and our services. So I just want to show you here how I go about it. I'm an ABAPer myself, and so often I'm learning AWS services for the first time. And just yesterday, I wanted to try something new. So I went to our main documentation page, which is a great place to explore on a rainy day and just look at all the different services we have in cryptography, IoT, blockchain. And for me, I went to machine learning. We've got 2 pages of machine learning services, text recognition, image recognition, speech to text, and everything else. And so I went and snooped around the Amazon recognition service, and all of our services have really comprehensive getting started guides and documentation and so forth. And in my case, I wanted to go and analyze faces in an image. And so I went in and snooped around here, and I found some Python code and easily translated it to ABAP. So this is a great place to go and explore. And in fact, you can really start dreaming. When I was looking at the recognition and the ability to count faces, I thought, well, gosh, what if I've got users who are using a handheld device to take a picture of broken machinery and submitting work orders for a broken equipment, attaching the image, and maybe this is going through an OData service, but I want it to reject the image if it has a person's face in it, because I don't, for privacy reasons, I don't want people's faces being embedded in images that are sloshing around my financial system. So now I could very easily go and enhance that BTP ABAP OData service to reject any image that has a face attached to it with probably 10 lines of code with the ABAP SDK. And that's what I love about it, that it's so easy to dream about doing something new. Did you see that we had a service with quantum computing? Can quantum computing speed up your month-end close? Who knows? You dream. We've made it possible. And that's what I love about the ABAP SDK. Now, one last point about where AWS fits in the universe, we have this joint reference architecture that we've collaborated with SAP to define the constellation of the universe. And at the center of the universe is BTP services. And the place to enhance your BTP services is here at the center with the CAP application Java here. And by the way, we have, of course, a Java SDK for AWS services. But now with the BTP ABAP, BTP ABAP can live at the center there too, enhancing using ABAP. And we have an SDK for BTP ABAP, so you can enhance your BTP ABAP with AWS services. Meanwhile, in the upper right-hand corner, your on-premises systems, classic ABAP like S/4HANA, maybe you don't have BTP ABAP yet. Well, we've got an SDK for the classic system also. And by the way, if you write some code against our classic ABAP SDK today, and then tomorrow you get BTP ABAP, our SDKs are line for line compatible. So you can take that same code you wrote today, classic on premises, and copy it right over to your BTP ABAP and use it there. So to tell you a little bit more about how to get started with our SDK, I'm going to turn it back over to Adam.
Great, thank you, John. Let me grab the screen. Okay, so hopefully that was really interesting. I always love John's demos. So I'm just going to wrap up with how you can get started. So let's just recap on some of the things we've covered in the last sort of 30 minutes. So choice. We're all about customer choice at AWS. We have the broadest set of cloud services, over 200 plus services, 60% more services than any other cloud provider, 40% more features, and some of the latest in AI, ML, IoT, analytics, and automation services. In terms of generative AI, we have enterprise-grade generative AI. So you have our Bedrock service, which enables you to build and scale generative AI applications. We have our Amazon Q service, which enables you to solve problems, generate content, to take action. And also in June this year, we also announced the integration of Amazon Bedrock into the SAP BTP Generative AI Hub as well. So you have choice. If you want to be developing CAP applications that are using Bedrock, you can do that through Gen AI Hub. Or if you want to build generative AI applications in ABAP, you can do that through the BTP SDK, calling Bedrock as well. And then purpose-built tools. So we very much focus on building tools for our developers, John said. So we've purposely built the SDK for SAP developers. So as we've already said, you've got the SDK, the ABAP SDK on stack for consuming the 200 plus services. And now in preview, you have the same SDK on top of BTP ABAP environment as well. And then John just showed you, we also have the joint reference architecture. So one of the key things we also believe is that actually we need to empower developers to learn. John showed you some of the ways that you can go and learn there by just looking at documentation, looking at existing code. We also have a lot of free training. So we have a service called AWS Skill Builder, and there's lots and lots of free training on there, over 600 digital courses covering 30 plus solutions. We specifically have 2 Skill Builder courses focused on SAP, and I've put the QR code there. So there's a course around modernizing SAP, and there's a course around architecting SAP. And not only that, we also have collaborated with SAP and built joint training on the SAP Learning Hub on how to actually architect resilient applications on SAP BTP with AWS. So that course is also available there for more general guidance on how you can build on top of BTP on AWS. So to wrap up, go build. As you'll see from my t-shirt, this is a t-shirt we wore at a hackathon. We'd love to participate with an innovation discovery workshop with you, or run a hackathon and explore how we can actually help your business, look at your pain points and where the SDK can help. Sign up for the preview. The QR code is there. If you don't want to use BTP, you want to start with your on-stack version, install the SDK in a sandbox, and develop a proof of concept very quickly. At AWS, we talk a lot about two-way doors and one-way doors. Use of the SDK is very much a two-way door decision. If you don't like what you're finding, or you find that it doesn't meet your needs, just stop using it. We don't charge for either the SDKs. You can install them completely free of charge. The only thing you will pay for is the services in AWS to consume. And for a lot of the services, it's actually a free tier. So you can get started for very little, if not zero cost. So hopefully you found that useful. Just to wrap up, there's mine and John's contact details on LinkedIn. We'd love to talk to you more about the ABAP SDK. As you can tell, we're both very passionate about talking about writing SAP code. You can see the QR codes there. Please reach out to us, connect to us. And now we'd like to open up to any other questions that we haven't been able to answer as you've been watching this recorded session. So thank you very much.